director here will tell me a little bit further in. So, great, thank you very much. So, my name is Felicity Parnham. I'm a councillor with Charlton Kings Parish Council, and now I'll take this off because I realise I'm now wearing it. As you noticed, we are asking people to wear masks if they can. If you want to ask questions, then obviously please take your mask off if that's easier. But just to make everybody feel a little more comfortable. Can I just say thank you to everybody for doing this? Because it is tough, it's a tough call whether we do these things online or in person. And so to be able to come here in person and see people and be able to do this, thank you very much. My name is Felicity Parnham, Charlton Kings Parish Council. I kind of took up the challenge about 21 months ago to lead with what we now call CK Futures, which is a project that the Parish Council has put together in the response to the climate emergency declared by Cheltenham Borough Council. And there's a number of initiatives running through this. So, and I've managed to talk to a few of you this evening. There's a few things on here that you might interest you. For instance, we have something called the A to Z of Sustainability, which we did with youth ambassadors. We've got Sustainable Charlton Kings, which is a Facebook site. So happy to talk to people after this event. But what you've come here today is to hear Eoin McQuone from Go Climate Positive to talk to us a little bit about small businesses and what small businesses can do to reduce their carbon footprint. The name of the talk is How Can Small Businesses Help Tackle the Climate Crisis? So, despite what Eventbrite might have told you, you won't be here for 3 hours. I'm so sorry. I could make it 4 if you want, but no, you won't. The plan is that we will be finished roughly by about 8 o'clock. And so I've hard and fast asked Ian to do this, present for about half an hour, and then we'll have a half an hour Q&A. Before I kind of throw into Ian, I'd also like to introduce you to Laura, who's sitting at the back, from Glow Innovation. Laura Gelder-Robertson. We met a couple of weeks ago at a brewery, as one does, on a seed swap.
A better place to meet.
Exactly, that's the place for us. And she just talked about this exciting project that she's got going, and it's about giving small businesses a voice. And her origami hummingbird installation will be going to COP26, and so they're creating these hummingbirds, and I'll get Laura to tell you a bit more a bit later, but by all means at the end as well, go and have a chat with her and see what it's all about. So, I'm not going to say too much. Ian is the founder and chief coach and founder of Go Climate Positive. I've got a few things I could say that I picked up from his website, but there was 4 principles that you put in there. I don't know if you're actually going to share those 4 principles.
I wasn't planning to, no.
Oh, well, I'm going to cheat then, and I wrote them because I was so impressed with them. Go Climate Positive, the 4 guiding principles: put more into the world than we take out, be brave and use mistakes as a learning opportunity, collaborate widely to deliver the best outcome for all, and keep agile and continually adapt. I thought they were good ones for life. So anyway, over to you, Ian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felicity, and thank you everybody for coming. I hope you have a good evening. Hopefully together we can learn something. By all means, if anything's not clear, or you want me to expand on anything, there'll hopefully be plenty of time at the end for questions. So, as Felicity says, I am Ian from Go Climate Positive. I spend my time working with small businesses to help them measure and reduce their carbon footprint. So, let's crack on with it. He says, hopefully, technology all decides to go. Wouldn't you know? My battery's just decided to run out. I have to go. I'm going to have to lean forward now and press the button. It's terrible, isn't it? The energy we have to expand. Okay, not to worry. So, this is what I want to cover tonight. First of all, give you a bit of context. I'm not going to talk about the need to reduce carbon. I think everybody here is probably already very much sold on that, so I'm not going to spend time talking about that. But I think it's useful to set a bit of context about the contribution that business makes, particularly small business, make to the country's carbon footprint. We're going to talk about what a carbon footprint for a business actually is, because not everybody, it might sound obvious, but not everybody has a clear understanding of that, and it's perhaps a little bit wider than many people realise. Then we're going to get into the meat of it. What can smaller businesses do to reduce their emissions? And I've got 6 categories of ideas, and I don't know, 5 or 6 ideas in each, so hopefully that's plenty of ideas to go around. Then I want to talk to you about, everyone's heard of a carbon footprint, but I want to talk to you about a different concept called carbon handprints, which hopefully you'll find interesting too, and give you some food for thought. Then I'll talk a little bit about offsetting, because it's always something I get asked about. And within that context, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, because again, I get asked about that a lot, and there's a lot of confusion, and many people think they're the same thing, which they're not. And then give you some ideas about what you might do as the next step to go away from here. Hopefully I've inspired you to make a start. So, let's talk about the context first. So, the UK government has committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and to make a 78% reduction by 2035. That second part is arguably as important, perhaps more important than the net zero part, because a lot of people think net zero is just about balancing up by offsetting. The reduction is the key principle. So the fact that they've made that commitment to make a deep reduction quite, by a relatively short time frame is very, very good. In our local context, Cheltenham Borough have committed to achieve net zero by 2030. I don't think we've got a specific reduction target as a part of that yet, although I'm sure we will before too long. But what does net zero mean? As I mentioned, I'm going to cover that later. Apologies for the busy slide. I think it's worth understanding what contribution business makes to the greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And this is actually a chart from 1990 to 2018 of contribution of various key sectors, if you like, towards our carbon footprint. And you can see business here is this green line here, accounting for around about 18 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. You can see has reduced a little bit over time. Although we've done quite well at reducing our emissions as a country since 1990, you can see most of that so far has come from our energy supply, and that needs to keep going down. But you can see, business has a big contribution to make. But it's more than just that 80 tonnes, because if you look where the other big numbers are, transport in particular, and energy. If you think about it, business is a huge user of energy, and also is one of the main drivers of transport. So a large part of these two elements can also be attributed to business. So roughly, business accounts for about 2/3 of our emissions, all in, if you account all those together. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you this slide, because this is hot off the press. This is a new survey that's just been released by the British Business Bank, and it talks exactly to our subject tonight. So this was a survey of small businesses and what they're actually doing in their transition to net zero. And there's some really interesting facts and figures on here that I thought I would share. So firstly, of that roughly 2/3 of our emissions, small businesses account for about half. So we always think, when we talk about businesses' contribution to emissions, we think, oh, it's all about big businesses, and we've got to get big businesses doing everything, and we do. But we can't ignore smaller businesses, and there's been a bit of a tendency to do so. Because half of the emissions are in these smaller businesses, so we need to give them the support that they need. At the same time, small businesses are mostly at the early stage of their transition. So 3/4 have not yet implemented a decarbonisation strategy. So there's plenty to go. This, of course, is good news for my business, but that's by the by. It's a large amount of emissions. Very few have actually really started to engage and get a strategy together. That said, the good news is nearly 94% have said, yes, we've done something. We've made a start. We've started to do something. So that says that most of these businesses are engaged in wanting to do something. almost 60% are aware of the government's commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, but interestingly, split half and half as to whether they see it as a high priority. So only just over half are ready to prioritise decarbonisation now. Still, that's plenty to be getting on with. Hopefully, as time goes on, we can work on the other half who are not quite ready. If we look at the reasons why small businesses haven't engaged as yet, about a third of them, just over a third, cite cost as a barrier, and there's this big perception that it's going to be expensive. It ain't necessarily so, but I can understand why there's that perception out there. So one of the key messages I always want to give is maybe not as expensive as you think to get engaged with this, and actually some of the things you do may even save you some money, although there may be some investment, that's true. But interestingly also, a third are saying, well, it's not feasible because we don't have control of our building, we're a tenant in our building. And this highlights one of the paradigms, I think, of carbon reduction, that everybody thinks it's just about their energy use. They think it's just about the electricity they use and the fuel they heat. I'm going to share with you shortly why that is very, very far from the truth. There are lots of ways in which businesses can help reduce their carbon emissions. And 12% decided lack of information. I suspect that's rather low, because most business owners I speak to say, yeah, I'd love to do something, I just don't know where to start. And that's really the biggest thing. So I suspect that number's a little bit undercalled. So hopefully again today I can persuade you that it's maybe not as scary and difficult as you might think. So there's a bit of context, hopefully that's useful. What I want to talk about now is, we've spoken about carbon footprint of business. What actually does it consist of? What it entails? Because it's important that we all have a similar understanding before we get on and talk about how we can reduce it. So the first thing to understand is it's not just about carbon. We talk about carbon footprint because it's a simple way of talking about it. The truth is there are many greenhouse gases, many gases which we emit through our activities that contribute towards global warming. Yes, carbon dioxide, CO2, is the most numerous one and the most important one, but it's by no means the only one. Methane is the second biggest contributor. That's produced when biological things decompose in landfill. So there's an awful lot of methane from that, which is why it's so important to segregate our food waste and not put that into landfill. And it's also produced a lot in particularly livestock farming, so ruminant animals, as they're digesting, do produce a lot of methane too. Nitrous oxide is the third most important one. That's produced in various industrial processes whenever you're making cement, when you're making fertiliser and so on. It's also a product of combustion when you're burning fossil fuels. And then we've got some of the lower components, so HFCs and PFCs are typically refrigerants used in fridges and air conditioning units. These are what replaced CFCs, which if you remember we banned in the 1990s because they were depleting the ozone layer. So it's a great environmental success story. We banned CFCs and the ozone layer has largely recovered. Unfortunately, what we replace them with, although they don't damage the ozone layer, they have a huge global warming potential, many thousands times more than carbon dioxide. So if you even get a small leakage of these, they can have a very big impact. We've also got sulfur-hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride. So when we're talking about the carbon footprint of a business, what we're actually talking about is the combined effect of all these things. For simplicity, we talk about it as carbon dioxide equivalents. So this is why you often see CO2e. That little e stands for equivalent. And what we're saying is, to make it simpler, so we can talk about one number, we work out the total warming potential of this gas of each of these gases over 100 years, so that we're talking on a level playing field. Now that's useful because it allows us to talk about one simple number. Sometimes it's not so useful because actually the rates at which these different gases have an impact are actually different. So for instance, methane over 100 years is 25 times as warming as carbon dioxide. Over 10 years it's 80 times. So it actually has a much quicker impact. So actually we could have a much quicker impact if we reduced the amount of methane we're producing now. That would have a much more immediate impact than carbon dioxide. So not that we shouldn't be reducing carbon. But nevertheless, we wrap all these things up under one number called a carbon footprint. And I mentioned it's not just about our energy use. The carbon footprint of a business is all the emissions for which it has an influence. So yes, that is the energy used in its operations, fuel and electricity, but also all the products and services in its supply chain are all using energy and creating greenhouse gas emissions as they provide those products and services. Similarly, very often the provision of the company's products and services involve greenhouse gas emissions too. So it may be that the business isn't wholly responsible for all of these, but it certainly has a shared responsibility with its supply chain for what's coming in, and it has a shared responsibility with its customers for products and services. So it has an influence, much wider influence than just energy use. And if we delve into this in a little bit more detail, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the standard that everybody uses worldwide, which tells us how to measure the carbon footprint of a business or organisation, actually breaks it down into all these different groups. And any time you start reading about carbon emissions, you'll start hearing this terminology, scope. So it will hopefully demystify that a little bit for you. So we have the scope 1 group of emissions, which are the emissions produced directly by your operations, by the fossil fuel use in your operation. So that might be use of fuels in your buildings, so that might be your gas boiler or oil-fired boiler, or even your biomass boiler. Use of fuels in your vehicles, and any greenhouse gases that you directly release through the industrial processes that you use, or through escaping, refrigerants escaping. Then the other group that's in your operations is what's called scope 2. So that's emissions produced indirectly. So they're produced somewhere else, but directly by the things that you're responsible for doing. So for most organisations, that's the emissions produced by the electricity they buy. Then you've got this bunch over here that are called the scope 3 upstream. So these are the emissions produced in your supply chain, which you have a shared responsibility with your suppliers. And you can see, it involves business travel, all the goods and services you purchase, how you transport them into your business and possibly out of your business too. What happens to the waste that you produce? Your employees, if they're commuting into your office or if they're working from home, you have a shared responsibility for the emissions associated with those too. If you're leasing assets rather than owning them, then the emissions associated with those can end up in scope 3. So, just because you don't own the vehicles doesn't mean you're not responsible for the emissions that are produced. On the other side, what's called the scope 3 downstream emissions, you've got everything to do with your customer activity, if you like, or the outputs of your business. So, yeah, it might be transporting your products and services. It might be the further processing. So if you're, say, a subcontract business that supplies a component to another manufacturer who then makes it into something else, then a portion of those emissions that are making the product belong in your carbon footprint too. If you're selling a product that uses energy, then the lifetime emissions of that product as it's being used also belongs in your carbon footprint. And indeed what happens to the product at the end of its life and processing that. Similarly, if you lease assets or if you're a franchisor, or if you're an organisation that has a lot of investments, all of those, the carbon footprint of those, the emissions in all of those all contribute towards your own business's emissions. So you can see it's really very broad and it encompasses pretty much all of the emissions that you have either direct or an indirect influence over. The good news is that means there's lots of targets for reduction. It's not only going to be about reducing energy use. And at this point, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I want to impress on you what I think is really important, the importance of measuring our footprint. Measuring your carbon footprint by these categories, I think is important for 3 reasons. Firstly, it gives you lots of targets to go at. Typically, when we think about reducing carbon, we think about reducing our energy use. For most businesses, that energy use is typically only 20 to 40% of of their total emissions. So by measuring all the others, you're getting lots more targets. It also allows you to track progress, and you know how much you've done, you know where you've come from, you know how much reduction you've achieved, and how much you've still got to go. If you're going to achieve net zero, how can you possibly know whether you've reached net zero if you haven't measured what your emissions were in the first place? And really importantly, it creates evidence. It creates evidence that you've actually, of the impact you've actually had that you can use with your customers. But it's also really becoming more and more important to use that evidence just in generally the way you communicate, because sadly, you know, we've all seen lots of times where businesses have massaged the facts or perhaps been a little bit over enthusiastic in their claims, otherwise known as greenwashing. And interestingly, last month, the Competition and Mergers Authority actually released a whole new initiative called the Green Claims Code. And it's very, very good because it gives very specific information on how to make sure, how to avoid greenwashing and make sure your environmental claims are live up to scrutiny. But what they've said is, we're publishing it now. From the new year, from January, we're going to start policing it. So it's increasingly important for businesses who are making environmental claims to have the evidence to back up what they're doing. And the way we do it is to implement a simple process like this is the carbon management cycle that I use with my clients. Essentially this is an annual cycle that goes something like, we calculate our emissions, we set targets and actions to reduce it. If we want to be carbon neutral, we offset, more of that later. Then we communicate what we've done. And it's really important, that communication part is really important because social proof is one of the biggest tools that we have. When a lot of small businesses say, well, I'll start doing it when everybody else is doing it. So by communicating and saying you're doing it, you will be influencing and helping others get on that journey too. Then it's really important to do the actions that you said you're going to do. Keep going around like that, and where possible, help others, and that's where carbon handprinting comes in, which we'll talk about later too. It isn't necessarily costly or difficult to do this measuring. Yes, you can come to somebody like me who can help you to do it, but equally, one of the best tools I've come across for small businesses is actually free. It's called 360-degree carbon. It's free for small businesses, for charities and for churches, and they've got 3 different versions specifically tailored towards those. You can quite easily get on there, put in the data, and it categorises all of your emissions for you, and you can actually do it year on year, so you can track your emissions. So if you want to make a start, it's a pretty good place to do it. It's not completely comprehensive, but it's reasonably comprehensive, and it's very easy to use. Okay. So hopefully we've set some context. We now all understand what a carbon footprint is. We'll get into the meat of what we're here to talk about, which is how can a small business reduce their emissions. But before we do that, yes, it's audience participation time. I'm not going to let you get away with standing there or sitting there quietly. And if some of you will probably recognise the music, you might get an idea of what we're going to do next. Okay. Yes, it's time to play your carbon right. And no trademarks are infringed in the production of this game, I hope. I'm sure you all recognise the music. You all remember Brucey's Play Your Cards Right. Well, this is exactly the same, but it's just with carbon. And the reason I do this is a bit of fun, but a lot of us have a bit of difficulty getting a head around what does a carbon dioxide equivalent actually mean tangibly, because it's just a number and it doesn't mean anything. So this is a bit of a fun game that will help us set our minds in the context to hopefully get a better, clearer idea of what a CO2e actually is. So, you all know the rules. Is it higher or lower? You don't need to take off your mask because we can all hear whether it's going to be higher or lower, but let's get involved and we'll do a bit of shouting out. So, obviously the first one is always most difficult because you don't know what the number is. And I should give a big thanks to Mike Berners-Lee for his book, How Bad Are Bananas? And if you've read his wonderful book, How Bad Are Bananas, then you might have a bit of a head start in this game because all of the examples come from there. And if you haven't read it, buy it, because it's a wonderful coffee table book. So, has anybody who hasn't read the book, perhaps, anybody give me an idea, roughly, what you think the carbon footprint of a banana is? And I'll give you a clue, it's in grams. Any ideas? Anybody want to be brave? 100? 100. That's a very, very good guess indeed. In fact, it's 80 grams of CO2 each, so that's very, very close. So I can tell you're going to do well at this game. Okay, so now we've set the bar. We've got the carbon footprint of a banana, 80 grams of CO2 each. Do we think boiling a litre of water is higher or lower? What do you think? Higher. We've got I think the consensus is higher there. Well, I'm going to surprise you. It's actually 70 grams of CO2. It's a little bit lower. And that's assuming that you're boiling it in an electric kettle with the lid on. Because if you put it in a saucepan with the lid off, then it's going to use more energy. And it's also assuming you're doing it in the UK with the UK's standard fuel mix. If you buy renewable electricity, then it might be a little bit lower. Again. But it's surprising, isn't it? We always think that energy use, boiling water, is going to be a lot. But of course, bananas do have, don't have a problem, but there is a fact of life with bananas that they do come from abroad. So of course, there's transportation. And maybe the next one will give us a clue as to how much of a contribution that transportation makes. So what about an apple? And let's assume this is a nice apple, local apple, maybe from the Vale of Evesham, not come very far, and it's in season. So do we think that's going to be higher or lower than boiling a litre of water? Lower. Everybody says lower, and of course you're right. Much lower, 80 grams of CO2. Now the carbon in an apple is much the same as the carbon in a banana. So you now start to get an idea just how much of the carbon footprint of a banana is in the transportation. And that's on a boat. So it's using a low carbon method of getting it here. If you're eating the kind of vegetable that has to fly across the world in order to be fresh, then it will be much higher again. Okay, we move to a completely different type of activity. This is something all of us have been doing a lot for the last 2 years. Watching the TV for an hour. Is watching the TV for an hour higher or lower than eating an apple, do we think?
Higher.
Everybody says higher. Of course it's higher, it's much higher. 96 grams of CO2 each. That does actually include the manufactured, what we call the embodied carbon in the telly, which is very high. So, a much healthier activity. Riding a bike for a mile. How does riding a bike for a mile compare with watching the telly for an hour? Is it higher or lower?
Higher.
Well, there's a lot of lowers, there was one higher. Well, it's interesting, in a way, you're kind of both right. Because it all depends on what you fuel the person riding the bike on. So, if the person riding the bike is fueled on bananas, it is indeed lower at 65 grams. If they're fueled on cheeseburgers, sorry to say, it's rather higher at 260 grams. Which just goes to show that simple decisions we make on a daily basis actually have a real impact on our emissions. So yeah, anyway, enough of that frivolity. But hopefully that's helped you get some context. Let's talk about what small businesses can do to reduce their emissions. And I want to talk about 6 different targets. Now it's going to be the case, not every business is the same, and I've learnt that a lot over the last couple of years. Every business is different. So all of these won't be applicable to all businesses, but some of these will be applicable to every business. And so pick and mix the ones that work for you. And let's work through each of these target categories. So let's look at energy first, because that's always the first thing we think of. So why not let's start there. And let's have a think about some of the things we can do. So the first and most obvious thing is switch it off. Sounds obvious, doesn't it? But if it's not being used, switch it off. So many businesses don't realise they have machinery, they have lighting, they have all sorts of things going on all evening, all weekend. Do a survey of all the electrical equipment you've got. Is it being left on when it doesn't need to be on? Talk to your employees, your staff. Have a bit of an engagement campaign. This is one of those things where everybody can get involved. Switching it off is the simplest thing because it completely cuts out emissions, and of course it's going to reduce your bills, which is going to save you money too. So I know it's simple, but sometimes the simple and obvious is the thing to do. If you have boilers, they do need maintaining. If you have fridges, industrial fridges, they do need maintaining. And make sure they're set at the right temperatures. If your fridge is set 1 or 2 degrees, it's colder than it needs to be, probably. And therefore, it's using much more energy than it needs to be. So make sure it's on the right temperature. Similarly, your boiler, does it need to be set to 22 degrees? Probably not. You could all, make sure you're wearing appropriate clothing. So maintaining your equipment, setting the right temperatures, again, something that's also going to save you money because it's going to save energy. If you've got premises, again, a very simple thing to do if you haven't done already, switch your lighting to LEDs when it's time to switch. The payback on LEDs now is less than a year typically. Yes, they're more expensive to buy, but they use so much less energy that you're actually saving money very easily by using those. If you're having a more thorough refit, and you can fit sensors that only switch them on when people are in certain rooms, especially if you've got rooms which aren't used very often, even better. Go renewable, the simplest thing that everybody can do if they've got control over their bills. Now it's true, a lot of small businesses are tenants, don't necessarily have control over where they buy their electricity from, but that's not true for everybody. A lot of businesses do have control over that, even when they are tenants sometimes. It's also, by the way, one of the simplest things we can all do as individuals and households. You can buy renewable energy from most providers these days. These are probably the 4 that I think, certainly 4 of the greener ones. Maybe some of the smaller ones also are too, although of course recently we've discovered that sometimes small isn't quite as beautiful as we thought. We weren't quite as robust, but I think all these are likely to be fairly robust. And they don't necessarily cost a lot more these days. A few years ago renewable did cost a lot more, but it's all, yes, it might cost a little bit more, but it's all roughly in the same kind of area. Another thing you can do, get a free energy survey from Target 2030. We're very lucky in Gloucestershire to have one of the best energy survey providers in the country. They're so good that they're mopping up funds that are not being used from elsewhere around the country too. So if you have premises, Target 2030, so that's part of 7Y Energy Agency, can come in and give you a free energy survey with detailed results saying this is what you can do in your premises to save energy. And then, working through them, you can actually get a grant for up to 30% of the cost of installing the energy saving equipment. So this, if you're not sure what to do, this can give you specific information on what to do and also help fund it. And of course, whatever you do is going to save you money in the long run too. So it's a win-win all round. So this is actually, believe it or not, this is still mopping up the last of the EU money. So if we don't use it, we lose it. So encourage anybody you know who's got a business or premises to get this energy survey while it's still there, because it's totally free. It's a great service. Let's look at the second area, travel. For a lot of small businesses, especially service businesses, this is often the biggest contributor, I find, is travel. So what can we do? First thing, again, a little bit like switch it off. The simplest things are often the most effective. Think before you drive. Do you actually need to get in the car and make that journey? If it is a journey that has to be made, does it have to be made in a car? Can you go on the train or on the bus? I know they're a little bit difficult at the moment, but these times will pass. Can you get on the bike? We're lucky in Cheltenham. We have the electric scooters. There's Wing. If you haven't had a go on them, honestly, they're the best fun. So, and how often can we associate fun with saving the planet? Not often enough, sadly. So get on the electric scooter or walk. Get on the bike. Get on the e-bike. Whatever. But think before you drive. What will help you with that is recording your journeys. Yeah, just the simple act of recording them. It helps you with your claiming your expenses, or if you're a sole trader with your tax at the end of the year. But yeah, recording your journeys and making sure all your staff record their journeys is a really good way of helping you realise just how much driving is actually being done. You know, one of the blessings of the last couple of years is that we've actually all got used to online meetings, and maybe they're not our favourite thing, but they can be very effective. And yes, maybe the first time you meet somebody, you do want to go and meet them face to face and build that relationship. But second time and third time, particularly if it's a progress tracing type of meeting, do you need to get together? Not necessarily. And we've all got used to using Zoom, Teams, or whatever flavour of video you like. So could you use that more? Think about that as at least as an option. Finally, when you're looking at your vehicle replacement, your vehicle strategy, let's start planning in for electric. We know we're all going to have to be going electric by 2035. So let's start planning for it now, because it might be quicker and easier than you think. And actually, if you do a decent amount of miles, it's probably going to be cheaper. Everybody, tells me they think electric vehicles are expensive. They are expensive to buy. They're so much cheaper to run though, that in very many cases, if you look at the lifetime costs, they're actually cheaper, and this is particularly true for businesses. And we are really fortunate in Charlton to have a genuine expert in this at Cleveland Electric Vehicles. Matt Cleveland is a wonderful guy. He's always available to give advice, and he's not, your typical second-hand car salesman at all. His advice is sound. So, have a chat with him, see what your options are. But start. I think all businesses who have any kind of vehicles should be starting to plan that transition to electric now, because it will come faster than you think, and it could save you money. Third area we can look at then is our suppliers. Again, before you even go and buy anything, think before you buy it. Do you really need it? This is also something we can also do as individuals, isn't it? So we can use the waste hierarchy to help us here, reduce and reuse. So do I really need to buy this in the first place? If we are buying it, does it have to be new? Can we buy pre-used? Or can somebody else use it? We've got some great facilities in Cheltenham. Vision 21 have their reuse. I'm having a mental block. Reclaim. Thank you. I can't remember that name. I don't know. Thank you. We've also got, if you've got old IT equipment, we've got IT Schools Africa, fantastic charity base here in Cheltenham, who can make use of that, make really good use of your old IT equipment too. Secondly, if you are going to buy it, can you buy a more environmentally friendly version? Something that's less toxic, uses less energy, creates less waste, or uses less water. If you can, that's great, but something I mentioned earlier, evidence. Look for evidence. Don't just take the manufacturer's word for it, because it's very easy to just write some advertising copy that says, yes, this is an eco-friendly product. But is it really? Where's the evidence? Is it backed up by any kind of certificate, standard, or some third-party endorsement? Or is it just fluff? Again, think about, where it's possible, is there a local option? Because that transportation of products is very often a large source of emission. If you think back to the difference between the banana and the apple, 80% or more of those emissions were actually in the transportation. So if you can, look at my logo. If you're buying food, can you buy it seasonally? Rather than shipping stuff halfway around the world. If you're going to ship from abroad, are you able to use a boat rather than air? Because that has a massive difference, both in terms of cost and in terms of carbon. Yes, it will take longer, so it might need more planning. Maybe we'll have a big impact. And the big thing, I think, and probably the biggest thing right now, is ask your suppliers, and I think this is something we can all do. It doesn't cost us anything other than a little bit of time. Is expect more from your suppliers and ask them, what is your carbon strategy? Have you got a carbon reduction plan? Have you committed to net zero? What are you doing to produce lower carbon products? if all of us who are customers, whether they're businesses or individuals, put pressure on our suppliers to say, we expect you to do this, we want you to do this, they're going to have to take notice. And that, by the way, includes, what we often forget, our digital life. So Zoom, Microsoft, Google, all these software providers, they're all using energy. And actually, it's amazing when I add those things up for a lot of small businesses. It's often quite a surprisingly substantial proportion of their carbon footprint. And they're all a little bit mysterious as to what they're doing generally. So something I would encourage all of us to do is ask our suppliers, what are you doing? Have you got a net zero strategy? Then we look at, on the other side of it, the products and services that we're providing as an organisation. So, we've spoken about buying eco. Can you sell eco? Can the products that you're selling be less toxic, use less energy, create less waste, use less water? And if so, what are you doing to evidence that? We're starting to see products like Quorn actually have the carbon footprint of the product on the packaging. Government have said from 2025 they're going to actually produce national standards for product carbon footprinting. Going to start by voluntary, but by 2030 that's going to be mandatory for certain categories of products, certain sectors. Unfortunately, they haven't told us which ones yet, but hopefully we will learn that soon. But it's coming because consumer power is huge, and giving people information to make a more discerning choice is one of the key ways in which we can have an impact. And I'm quite certain that Quorn will be getting benefit from doing that early. The other thing is, try not to sell single-use anything. They talk a lot about single-use plastic, yes, but actually single-use anything is using resources in a not very efficient and not very effective way. And often a lot of the replacements for single-use plastic are not very easy to actually get rid of. You can't always put them in with the household recycling, in which case they end up in landfill anyway. So think about how can you cut out single-use anything. I know it's not always easy for certain types of businesses, but the more we can cut out single-use, the less waste we'll produce and the lower emissions we'll produce too. And of course, associated with that is very much packaging. And this is where we get so familiar with the waste hierarchy, we sometimes forget it. But reduce, reuse, recycle is still a really good mantra. Do you even need that piece of packaging? Can you get rid of it? If you must have it, actually, can you reuse it? I know a lot of businesses who, they buy a lot of stuff that comes in cardboard packaging. They can actually reuse that to send out their own products. Save them money too. What's not to like? And if push to shove, can you recycle it? I think there's no reason now why 100% of packaging shouldn't be recyclable. I see no reason at all why it shouldn't all be at least recyclable. Because it's all out there and available. And then finally, think about what's the lowest impact transportation method you can use to do the job that you need it to do. So can you use a boat rather than air? Can you use rail versus road? Can you use an electronic van versus diesel? So some of the transport, of the courier companies like DPD, for instance, have invested heavily in electronic vans. And so, can you find out who they are and start to use those? There are even some businesses delivering on bike versus vans, certainly in the bigger cities, that can be quite cost effective. We're getting through. I think this is the 5th one. So I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to crack on through. Another area that we tend to forget about, where we have a big influence as businesses, is with our employees, with our staff. So, first of all, get employees involved. My experience is that most employees want to get involved and would love to have the opportunity and feel much better about the business they work for when they have the opportunity to get involved. So get them involved. Can you encourage use of public transport? Yes, I know it might be difficult at the moment, but as I say, this time will pass, and public transport is so much lower in terms of emissions and getting in the car all the time. There are still things around like the Bike to Work scheme, which makes it easier for people to afford to buy a new bike if effectively they save their income tax. The value of the income tax or the value of the bike, if they save that income tax on that. Sorry. But now there's actually similar salary sacrifice schemes available for electric vehicles. So you can actually help your employees move to electric and save income tax at the same time. So there's a win-win all around there. And also maybe think about, is there some way in which you can reward or encourage your employees to switch to renewable energy at home? Particularly if you've got people working from home, then actually their home emissions, or a portion of their home emissions, become part of your business's carbon footprint too. So this will help reduce your carbon footprint, but also help them move and reduce their overall carbon footprint too. And then the last section I want to talk to you about is money, and this is something we forget about a lot. But again, we can have a huge influence through where our money is invested. So there aren't very many banks actually that have a great track record here. By far the most environmental bank is a bank that in the UK is based in Bristol. It's actually a Dutch bank called Triodos. Not always the easiest to make use of because they are literally one branch in Bristol, and they're not always taking on new customers, and they're not the cheapest that they can. But every penny that's invested there goes into helping make the environment better. So they are very ethical in that sense. The cooperative bank, on the other hand, is very widespread, raised to use. They have a very strong ethical policy. Some people have taken against them since they were taken over by a hedge fund, which maybe isn't ideal, but nevertheless, that hedge fund hasn't changed the ethical policy of the bank at all. They still don't invest in fossil fuels, and they've got a strong net zero commitment. And then perhaps a little bit more left field, Starling Bank maybe don't have quite the ethical credentials of the others, but they have committed to net zero. They don't invest in fossil fuels, and I was at a seminar last month where they said they're actually soon going to reduce their rate of lending to businesses who commit to net zero. So they're actually starting to come up the ranks as an ethical bank, particularly focused on carbon reduction. The other thing is workplace pensions. If you've got employees, everybody's got to have a workplace pension now. The good news is actually some of the easiest options here are some of the best. So Nest, which is the government's workplace pension scheme, is actually the only pension scheme in the UK that's committed to having net zero across all of their funds. Now they're not saying they're doing it today. I think they said by 2050 or something, so it's a long way away. But nevertheless, they have made that commitment. But they have an ethical fund, which is an option, and you have to give people the option. But you can at least make sure your employees are aware of these options. Similarly, the People's Pension, they've made a commitment to invest in companies committed to reducing carbon too, and to not invest in fossil fuels. So both of these. So actually, some of these, some of the most popular options in workplace pensions are actually some of the more environmentally friendly too. So hopefully that's given you plenty of targets for reduction. I do want to just briefly touch on offsetting because it's something we get asked about a lot, and specifically about this difference between being carbon neutral and net zero. So offsetting, the principle of offsetting is once you know how big your emissions are, you invest in projects which help save emissions somewhere else to the same level. So effectively you're balancing or offsetting the emissions you're producing. If you're carbon neutral, what you're saying is we're offsetting all the emissions we're producing now. So if my carbon footprint is 100 tonnes, I'm saving 100 tonnes or I'm doing 100 tonnes of offsetting. There's actually two types of offsetting you can do. One is what's technically known as avoided emissions, so that's helping somebody to save and reduce the emissions they're producing. The other type is what's called a removal emission, where you're actually physically removing carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, which by far the most well-known way of doing it is by planting trees or reforestation, because as trees grow they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. With carbon neutral you can use either of those. But one of the big things that people forget or don't realise about being carbon neutral businesses, there's no actual requirement to reduce your emissions at all. You can actually be carbon neutral year after year after year whilst increasing your emissions, as long as you keep on increasing your offsetting. So that being carbon neutral alone won't get us to where we need to get to without the commitment to reduce. The other issue with being carbon neutral is often it doesn't include all the emissions. So you get a lot of businesses saying, we're carbon neutral, and then the small print for our energy use or for scopes 1 and 2, and they're not covering all those emissions. So just be aware, if you see a claim for carbon neutrality, read the small print. On the other hand, net zero is actually mostly about reducing emissions. So guidelines on this have clarified in the last few months. And if business now wants to claim to be net zero, then it needs to be thinking about reducing its emissions by 90% first, and then offsetting the last little bit that's left. So that's a huge difference. You need this massive reduction and then offset what's left, rather than offsetting the huge bit that's now. Secondly, net zero is about, if you think globally, net zero is about eliminating all the emissions we possibly can, and then offsetting what's left. So if you've removed all the emissions you possibly can, the avoidance option is no longer available. The only option that's available is to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So when we do our net zero offsetting, it's removals only. And it has to cover the whole of scope 1, 2 and 3. All those different categories I shared with you earlier. If it doesn't cover all of those, it ain't net zero. Now there's lots of ways of doing offsetting. From a business claim point of view, I would argue it's important to get to do it using carbon credits that have a third-party certification. Simply because that way provides you evidence with a certificate saying, yes, this saves the amount of carbon I think it's saving. It doesn't mean that projects that don't carry these certifications are necessarily bad, but it does mean you haven't got that third-party evidence to back it up, which as a business I think is important to be able to have. These are the two most popular certification programs. There are plenty of others out there, but these are the ones which probably are the most well-known, the gold standard and the verified carbon standard. Another way of doing offsetting, very popular, and probably the first thing that springs to everybody's mind, is planting trees. Now, planting trees is a great thing to do if it's done well. And I'd encourage all businesses to think about funding that. However, it's not always the easiest option for offsetting purposes for carbon neutrality or net zero, because it can be very difficult to account for the amount of carbon that's saved properly, not least because trees absorb carbon as they grow. So they'll absorb it over 25, 50, 100 years. Sitting here today, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen to that tree in 50 years' time. That's one of the problems. Second problem is, you've already emitted carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's already warming. Now you plant a tree, and then you're saying, well, over the next 25, 50 years, it's going to absorb carbon. There's a mismatch. You're not really stopping global warming. So planting trees and rebuilding those ecosystems is a really important thing to do. But it's probably best to do it in addition to your offsetting, rather than instead of. Which brings me to my last little piece, where I want to introduce you to the concept of a carbon handprint. And this is, if you like, the corollary of a carbon footprint. If our carbon footprint is the impact that we leave on the earth, of all the negative impacts of what we do on the climate, our carbon handprint is what we give back. And we give it back by making a contribution towards saving carbon beyond our own value chain, beyond what we're legally, if you like, responsible for. And say, well, let's, if you like, have us in a spirit of generosity, let's see how much carbon we can actually save beyond what we have to do. And there's various ways we can do it. So planting trees is a great way to do it, as I've already mentioned, as long as it's done well. So make sure you're doing it with an organisation that understands the ecology, because the worst thing we can do is to plant a massive plantation of one single species which isn't necessarily native to that area, and then actually what you do is you lose biodiversity. So it must be done well with organisations that know what they're doing. So you can support wildlife charities. You can help your suppliers to reduce their emissions, not just on the products that you buy, but on all the products that everybody else buys. So you're actually helping all of their other customers to reduce their emissions too. You can collaborate with your competitors. What is this strange idea that is? But actually, this is what organisations that often represent lots of businesses within a sector, and most sectors have them. Get onto those organisations and say, well, why don't we all work together to reduce our emissions? Because we are in a race. We are in a race to get to zero emissions, but it's a very unusual race because we only win when the last person crosses the line. So in this case, it isn't actually anti-competitive to work with your competitors here. We all win when the last person crosses the line. You can look at selling low carbon products, so your customers actually reduce their own emissions too. Maybe you can even recycle waste for your customers. A lot of waste that's produced by products can be very hard to recycle, so can you actually take responsibility for doing that? Maybe you could even buy your employees an energy efficiency report from 7Y. So as well as doing energy efficiency reports for businesses, 7Y also do them for houses. And it costs a few £100. If you know, that could be a bonus perhaps for employees who work with you for a long time or whatever. There are many ways in which you can think about having a handprint that's beyond what you just need to do. And the last thing I'm going to suggest that you do, which every business in Cheltenham can do, and every business in Cheltenham we hopefully should do, is to join Cheltenham Zero. And I'm pleased to say, timing is impeccable because the Cheltenham Zero website went live today. So everybody's got the opportunity to get on there and make the pledge to support Cheltenham's bid to become net zero by 2030. That's something that everybody can get involved in. So I'm mindful of time. I know it's supposed to be half an hour, but I have to at least finish before 8. So that was me. I'm Ian from Go Climate Positive, and I hope you found that helpful.
Thank you. I mean, there's still time for some questions. And forgive me that I was scribbling down because I tend to do that. It helps me to remember. And there's some really good things. And actually, I'm going to. It's always the worst that you talk about the last thing, but I think that the last person crossing the line is really a good way to kind of think about this, because that's what this is all about. But I'm going to open it up. Is there any questions for Ian?
It's good you were spoken until 5 to 8. Well, I have to credit Laura at the back there for the last person crossing the line. She reminded me of that when I spoke to her earlier. That's all I said. That is actually a very good analogy. So credit where it's due.
I've got to say a question. There's a couple of things that come to me in what you're talking about for businesses. For the business that's really kind of busy, its heads down, it's okay, these people talking about all this carbon stuff, but I've got a business to run, I've got profits. There's something to me about these two things. You kind of touched on one of them, which was, in a sense, reward, hopefully by saving money. But there's another about making it easy. And I don't know if there's anything in there you want to talk about in what are the three things out of all that would say make it easy for businesses?
Well, the easiest thing that every business can do, first of all, is to switch to renewable electricity. That really doesn't take a lot of effort. I'm not going to say that it's all easy. If you're going to do it, there's a little bit of effort involved. I always try to make it easy for my clients by just saying, look, go to somebody who knows what they're talking about, and they will talk you through that process. They'll hold your hand through that process, whether it's me or somebody else, and it won't be necessarily as complicated as you think. But make a start. Do one thing. You don't have to save the world all in one go. You don't have to do all these things. Just pick the one thing that I've mentioned today that's like, yeah, I feel like I can do that, and then do that, and actually you build up a bit of momentum that way.
Good advice. When we did a survey of the residents a few months ago, in fact, Ian's just kind of touched on it in the middle of this. One of the things was, where do I start? And so part of for instance, for CK Futurism and people, bringing people like Ian here and working with Vision 21 and others, is actually, the 7 White, it's actually helping people to find that start point. The trouble is we all have different start points. There's no kind of like magic wand here. So hopefully, you know, there's all those things. But also, in a sense, I think we have a responsibility to share our start, share our journey, share what we've learned. Some of it might not, you know, we might not have succeeded. There may, you know, there may be some things in here that we try and we don't succeed, or there's some things that we go, whoa, you know, that really made a difference to us. But if we don't actually start, as you point out, do the one thing, do the next thing, then this doesn't happen. Sorry, gentlemen, you had a question?
Yeah, there's a question right from the beginning. You said Cheltenham going for net zero. Well, what does that mean? Is that the municipal building? Is that the council's activities? Or is that Cheltenham town?
So that is Cheltenham Borough.
The whole borough?
That's what the commitment
The borough
is.
council?
Well, both. So the borough,
Yeah.
the council committed to achieving net zero as a council,
Yeah.
but they've also publicly committed to achieving net zero as a borough by 2030.
Including all the residents?
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Amazing, okay.
It's going to be a challenge,
Yeah,
but that's the commitment.
okay, thanks.
This actually comes quite nicely onto my question, and maybe it's sort of come from I'm trying to educate myself. And if that commitment has been made, and you mentioned there's 90% reduction, how do they know what the starting point is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a piece of work commissioned. I can't remember exactly when, but about 4 or 5 years ago, I think.
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
Apologies. Which gives a pretty good calculation of what the emissions in the borough are. It's not 100% there, but it's a pretty good estimate of most of them. So there is actually a starting measure. What I would say is the understanding of net zero has developed. So at the time when that was created, that 90% reduction probably wasn't as firmly embedded as it is now. So that does create an extra challenge. So exactly where the borough sits on that reduction plan, I think is still a work in progress, to be honest. Oh, yes, hello.
Hi. I had a question on planting trees versus kind of restoring ecosystems and things like that. Obviously, we hear a lot about talk about planting trees and that's the way to go. But there seems to be a bit of a debate as to whether, in a lot of ways, that can be, like you've mentioned, it can be damaging in certain circumstances, and wouldn't it be better to do many more rewilding projects and restoring ecosystems?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. That's plenty. Yeah, there's some really good things to do.
But is that something that's available as kind of offsetting, or is it primarily tree planting, or is that offered as a project?
It's rarely available as a certificated, if you like. There probably are some out there. But as I say, you don't necessarily think about it as offsetting. Think about it as just part of your contribution to society, if you like, or to the community. So, Will's got ahead of that.
So I just wanted to build on it, because one of the initiatives I'm part of is the Million Tree Pledge, which is trying to kind of radically output what small businesses do around planting. And we work with Eden Reforestation, who are actually a US-based social enterprise, but they partner with Ecology from Bristol. And they're always looking at where is the greatest need globally in terms of the impact of climate change, in terms of new growth. They won't be planting monocultures, they'll be looking at the climatic context, and then if they're in Madagascar, they'll be planting mangroves. If there's greater need for planting sea kelp, they'll be looking at sea kelp reforestation. You're absolutely right that we have to be conserving existing forests, we have to be restoring our existing woodlands and looking after the lifelong protection of the trees. So people like the reforestation ecology are absolutely looking at, and similar to global standard, they'll verify what they're doing. And I think there's just been an injection of investment from some, I can't remember exactly what the technology is, but it's a much smarter way of linking into the satellites, and some kind of heat sensoring measures so that you can track using AI what's happened to the
much. Ian's got a fantastic website, the Go Climate Positive, so go and have a look at that, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any other questions as well to people here tonight or online, whatever. But just thank you for coming, and thank you to everybody else as well for being here. So thank you again, Ian. Before I kind of say farewell, I was just wondering, Laura, do you want to say a little bit about what you're doing? I gave you a very, very quick off at the beginning. Do you want to say a few words?
Firstly, I really enjoy Ian's talks, and he's like 20 years ahead of me. I'm like 18 months in, so I feel like a child in his presence, but I'm just always enjoying. So I am going up to COP26 as part of an initiative called Low Carbon Leaders, and this was a spin-off from the Cambridge University towards Net Zero Sustainable Leadership course that started in February. So the 8th module of that course, which is basically explaining the complex systemic challenge that climate change is to become change agents. So a bunch of us pulled together and collaborated and said we wanted to amp up particularly what small businesses can do, and we want to simplify their journey to net zero and make it a lot easier, and grab a lot more attention from the government, from the media, from local councils for funding to support them on that journey, because it feels like a lot of the attention and the resources are always pumped into the big business. So we're manifesting that as a kind of radical act of collective action in the shape of a swarm of hummingbirds. And we create a giant zero out of origami hummingbirds with the logos of all the small businesses that we've collaborated with that have helped us get to COP. And it's just to make the point that actually it sometimes feels like you're a bit of a drop in the ocean, but to Ian's point, sometimes you'll hit a roadblock, like you don't own your building as a small business, so you can't necessarily instantly switch your energy provider. But there'll be other things where you're facing a problem, or you've got some kind of waste product, and there'll be other people in your community that are facing exactly the same problem. And if you can swarm together, we can start talking about it. We call it kind of not greenwashing. So people are saying frightened of greenwashing, they're sort of greenwashing, they're not talking enough about it. So we're breaking it down and saying, okay, transport, could you travel 1 mile less using fossil fuels this week? How could you do it differently? And just making things feel a lot simpler and less sacrificial. So if anyone knows a small business, if you've got a small business and want to be part of that installation, we're going to be broadcasting it live from Glasgow next Thursday from the Net Zero Now Festival. You can just get in touch with me, grab a card and send me your logo or send me a friend's logo. We just want to give a voice to all the businesses, particularly from here. I'll take all the Cheltenham voices up with me that can't necessarily be at COP26. So you've got a story to talk about, and the fact that we can really come together. If we do come together and we start sharing, like you say, it's a race that we either all win or we'll lose. So might as well all win it together.
Thank you.
And then, if I may, there's one other thing I'll mention, because I think there's Vanessa's here. So another way in which we're looking at coming together in Cheltenham is in February next year. Vanessa and I and a few other people are working on a festival, what we're calling a festival of sustainability called From the Ground Up. And we're looking at having local businesses who've got some kind of environmental product or service to come in and demonstrate to members of the public what they can do, small changes that they can make in their lives. So if your business has an eco product or an environmentally friendly product or service of some sort, or you know somebody who does, do get in touch with myself or Vanessa, and we'd love to hear from you and make you a part of that day.
Thank you. And finally, before you go, it's a kind of perfect segue really. Our next talk, All Being Well, will be on the 17th of November, so slightly changed because we usually do the last Wednesday of the month. But we have managed to hopefully secure a few people who are going to COP 26, who are going to come and talk to us about their experience. We hope to do it at the front at 6 Ways, and it will be an informal conversation really, just hearing. So as Laura talked about, we send our voices to COP26. it would be great if those people have been able to go along, and I think I'm just in the, that Patricia, yeah, Patricia's one of those people who will also be there to come and hear, you know, firsthand their experiences, what they heard, what they felt, what happened. Obviously, we've no idea, you know, we've got no crystal ball, but it would be just good to hear for the community, for Cheltenham, to hear what happened and to bring that back to us. So that's for the plan is for the 17th of November, so kind of look out for that on our web pages and social media. So thank you very much again for coming. It's been a great evening, and yes, and thank you for putting up with